It's hard to get more controversial than topics like family structure and religion, but this last topic of Module 3 might have a shot. This is the question of whether and how we should punish children, and in particular, whether we should ever hit or spank children when they transgress. Like in many cases, the literature on spanking is entirely correlational, and with good reason. We can't randomly assign parents to spank or not spank their children. Still, once you see what these correlational data say, you should see that as a parent, the risks of spanking are substantial and the possible benefits are pretty much non-existent. Roughly, what the data tell us is that spanking is correlated with a host of very negative outcomes, the most significant of which is that children who get spanked are later more violent, which in turn leads them to get spanked even more, and so on. However, this doesn't prevent parents from continuing to spank their kids. These studies have also told us that 90% of parents in the US report having spanked their child at least once, and about 60% of mothers have done so within the last week. On average, children are spanked 3 times a week, with about 1.5% of kids getting spanked more than 15 times a week. Mothers spank more than fathers, probably because they spend a lot more time with their kids. Less educated and less wealthy parents tend to spank more. Frequent spanking is more common among African American parents than among Hispanic or Caucasian parents. And also, Protestant parents are more likely than parents of other religions to spank their kids. Finally, boys are more likely to be spanked than girls. However, independent of who is doing the spanking, recent studies suggest that the same outcomes exist. Children from all groups are more likely, not less likely, to act out and become violent if they are spanked than if they're not spanked. To get an outside perspective on this question, I spoke to my colleague at UCSD, developmental scientist Gideon Diak. I began by asking Diak what the evidence tells us about the effectiveness of spanking in shaping children's behaviors.
The immediate versus long-term consequences of spanking are that in the short term, there are a few studies that suggest that it is equally or perhaps a little more effective at getting children to stop a behavior. But in the long term, there are consistent correlations found with a number of negative outcomes. For example, there is damage done to the parent-child relationship. Children who are spanked more, even controlling for their prior tendency towards aggressiveness, show more aggressiveness long term. Okay, it does not seem to help with long-term compliance. That is, children who are spanked are not more compliant children in the long term.
Consistent with what I said before, spanking doesn't seem to have positive effects and may even have negative results. Related to this, I asked Diak if it wasn't a problem that all of this data was correlational.
Right. The evidence on spanking is almost entirely correlational. There isn't any consistent evidence that spanking is really helpful compared to other available forms of discipline that aren't coercive or violent.
As a child, like many kids, I was occasionally tapped on the behind. What I remember from this is thinking that it's very important to not get caught doing bad things. This led me to do things like lie to my parents or sometimes point the finger at a sibling when something bad had happened, and sometimes even to fear my parents when I'd done something bad. It's okay, Mom and Dad, I love you, but still it made me wonder how other kids react, especially when their spankings are more severe or more frequent. I asked Dr. Diak whether spanking has negative effects on parent-child relationships.
So the effect of spanking on parent-child relationships isn't understood in a lot of detail. Part of the reason is that there are cultural differences in how spanking is viewed. On a group level, there are negative correlations between the use of corporal punishment and the long-term quality of the parent-child relationship. That doesn't necessarily mean that every parent-child relationship is sort of damaged if the parent spanks, okay? But there are consistent negative correlations found.
Finally, I asked Diak about alternatives to spanking.
Strategies that tend to work better are to tie children's behaviors to natural consequences, okay, at every age. So it might be that, if the child doesn't get their homework done, they don't get to go out because they still have to stay home and finish the homework that they didn't do. Okay, a much younger child who doesn't clean up their place at the table, okay, would have the same consequence. They can't go watch TV, or they can't go, play in their room because they haven't done this thing that they need to do.
DX's comments on spanking are consistent with other expert opinions we find in the literature. Techniques like spanking, and even more moderate techniques like timeouts, might reduce a specific behavior in the short term, but overall they fail to produce positive outcomes in the long term. Experts suggest that we should use other techniques like positive reinforcement, praising and rewarding kids for positive outcomes. But beyond this, parents can go a step further. Probably the best advice I've heard that I use in my own home involves 2 steps. The first step is we teach our child through repeated examples that when she does something bad, she can talk to us and we won't get mad or violent. This, we hope, will encourage her to talk to us when things are going badly and discourage lying and covering up behaviors to the extent possible. Similarly, when she does something that we find a little mean or bad, we try to avoid telling her this in a judging way to make sure that she's willing to share again in the future. The more our kids talk to us, the more we can help them reshape their behaviors in the future. But of course, this isn't enough. The second thing we do is help our kid to imagine alternative ways to behave in the future so that when she encounters a similar situation, she has different ways to respond. So if she lashes out at one of us because she's frustrated, we ask her to calm down, give her some time alone so everyone can regain composure, and then we rehash what happened and think, I wonder what we could have done to make that work better. What could we do next time to make that easier? And what could we do next time that would prevent us from having a fight? This might sound crazy. Sometimes when a kid acts like a jerk, it seems like they just deserve a firm consequence. But what we think they deserve may actually have very little impact on how they behave in the future. Besides this, we use plenty of incentives in our house that reinforce positive behaviors. Dessert comes after you finish dinner. Hot chocolate comes after homework. TV on the weekend depends on doing chores throughout the week. A consistent and firm application of positive rewards like these that are removed when behaviors don't comply can be much more effective ways of shaping behavior that don't risk shutting down communication between parents and kids.